Hello, I was hoping you'd show up today. I was just about to go and take my medicine, and it had me thinking about one of my favourite books, George's Marvellous Medicine, written by Roald Dahl. Now, George's Marvellous Medicine is slightly longer than a book we might usually read, but that's okay, because we can read a bit of the book today, and then we can read a bit of the book another time, and that will give us something to look forward to. Now, before I start with George's Marvellous Medicine, there's a very important warning at the beginning, so listen carefully. Warning to readers, do not try to make George's Marvellous Medicine yourself at home. It could be dangerous. Chapter 1, Grandma. I'm going to the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning. So be a good boy and don't get up to mischief. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he might get up to. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, the mother said. Then out she went, closing the door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye and said,
Now you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine.
No, Grandma, George said.
And try to behave yourself for once while she's away.
Yes, Grandma, George said. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere, so there was never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as that grisly old grunion of a grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning.
You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start,
Grandma said to George.
That'll keep you out of mischief for a few minutes.
Yes, Grandma, George said. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small, puckered-up mouth, like a dog's bottom. How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma? George asked her.
1 spoon, she said, and no milk.
Most grandmothers are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies. But not this one. She spent all day and every day sitting in her chair by the window, and she was always complaining, grousing, grouching, grumbling, griping about something or other. Never once, even on her best days, had she smiled at George and said,
Well, how are you this morning, George? Or why don't you and I have a game of snakes and ladders? Or how was school today?
She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in it and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea.
It's not sweet enough, she said. Put more sugar in.
George took the cup back to the kitchen and added another spoon of sugar. He stirred it in again and carried it through to Grandma.
Where's the saucer? She said. I won't have a cup without a saucer.
George fetched a saucer.
And what about a teaspoon, if you please?
I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well.
I'll stir my own tea, thank you very much, she said. Fetch me a teaspoon.
George fetched her a teaspoon. When George's mother or father were home, Grandma never ordered George around like this. It was only when she had her all on his own that she began treating him badly.
You know what's the matter with you?
The old woman said, staring at George over the rim of her teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes.
You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy.
But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma, George said.
Of course you can, she snapped. Growing's a nasty, childish habit.
But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't grow, we'd never be grown-ups.
Rubbish, boy, she said. Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not.
But you did once, Grandma.
Only very little, the old woman answered. I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all those other nasty childish habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't given up any of those, have you?
I'm still only 8, Grandma.
You're 8 years old. That's not old enough to know better. If you don't stop growing soon, it'll be too late.
Too late for what, Grandma?
It's ridiculous, she went on. You're nearly as tall as me already.
George took a good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short that she had to have a footstool to put her feet on, and her head only came halfway up the back of the armchair. Daddy says it's fine for a man to be tall, George said.
Don't listen to your daddy, Grandma said. Listen to me.
But how do I stop myself growing? George asked.
Eat less chocolate,
Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow?
It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down.
Grandma sipped her tea, but never took her eyes from the little boy who stood before her.
Never grow up, she said. Always down.
Yes, Grandma.
And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead.
Cabbage? Oh no, I don't like cabbage, George said.
It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's good for you, and that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day, mountains of cabbage, and if you've got caterpillars in it too, so much the better.
Oh, said George.
Caterpillars give you brains,
The old woman said.
Mummy washes them down the sink, George said. Mummies are stupid as you, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs too.
Not slugs, George cried out. I couldn't eat slugs.
Whenever I see a live slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I'll gobble it up quick before it cools away. Delicious.
She squeezed her lips together tight so that her mouth became a tiny wrinkled hole.
Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you.
You're joking, Grandma.
No, I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all. They'll go crunch.
Grandma, that's beastly. The old hag grinned, showing those pale brown teeth.
Sometimes, if you're lucky, she said, you get a beetle inside the stem of a stick of celery. That's what I likes.
Grandma, how could you?
You find all sorts of nice things in sticks of raw celery,
the woman went on.
Sometimes it's earwigs.
I don't want to hear about it, cried George.
A big fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you've got to be quick, my dear, when you put one of those in your mouth. It's got a sharp pair of nippers on its back end, and it grabs your tongue with those, and it never lets go, and you've got to eat bite the earwig before it bites you.
George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get as far away as possible from this filthy old woman.
You're trying to get away from me, aren't you?
She said, pointing a finger straight at George's face.
You're trying to get away from Grandma.
Little George stood by the door, staring at the old hag in the chair. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He'd always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he wasn't so sure.
Come closer to me, little boy, she said,
beckoning him with a horny finger.
Come closer to me and I will tell you secrets.
George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either.
I know a great many secrets,
she said, and suddenly she smiled. It was a thin, icy smile, the kind a snake might make before it bites you.
Come over here to Grandma and she'll whisper secrets to you.
George took a step backwards, edging closer to the door.
You mustn't be frightened of your old grandma, she said with that icy smile.
George took another step backwards.
Some of us, she said.
And all at once she was leaning forwards in her chair and whispering in a throaty sort of voice George had never heard it used before.
Some of us, she said, have magic powers that can twist the creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes.
A tingle of electricity flashed down George's spine and he began to feel frightened.
Some of us, the old woman went on, have fire on our tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry in the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand up on end and your eyes pop out of their sockets.
George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed to be stuck to the floor.
We know how to make your nails drop off and your teeth grow out to your fingers instead. George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him most of all. The frosty smile, the brilliant, unblinking eyes. We know how to make you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you. Grandma! He cried, stop! We know secrets, my dear, about dark places where dark things live and squirm all around, over each other. George made a dive for the door. It doesn't matter how far you run, he heard her saying. You'll never get away from me. George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Chapter 2. The Marvellous Plan. George sat himself down at the table in the kitchen. He was shaking a little. Oh, how he hated Grandma. He really hated that horrid old witchy woman. And all of a sudden, he had a tremendous urge to do something about her. Something whopping. Something absolutely terrific. A real shocker. A sort of explosion. He wanted to blow away that witchy smell that hung around her in the next room. He may have only been 8 years old, but he was a brave little boy. He was ready to take this old woman on. I'm not going to be frightened by her, he said softly to himself. But he was frightened. And that's why he wanted to suddenly explode her away. Well, not quite away, but he did want to shake the old woman up a bit. Very well then. What should it be, this whopping, terrific, exploding shocker for Grandma? He would have liked to have put a firework banger under her chair, but he didn't have one of those. He would have liked to put a long green snake down the back of her dress, but he didn't have a long green snake. He would have liked to put 6 big rats in her room with her and lock the door, but he didn't have 6 big rats. As George sat there pondering this interesting problem, his eyes fell upon the bottle of Grandma's brown medicine standing on the sideboard. Rotten stuff, it seemed to be. 4 times a day, a large spoonful of it was shovelled into her mouth, and it didn't do her the slightest bit of good. She was always just as horrible after it as she had been before. The whole point of medicine, surely, was to make a person better. If it didn't do that, it was useless. Oh, thought George suddenly. I know exactly what I'll do. I shall make her a new medicine, one that is so strong, so fierce and so fantastic, it will either cure her completely or blow the top of her head off. I'll make her a magic medicine, a medicine no doctor in the world has ever made before. George looked at the kitchen clock. It was 10:05. That was nearly an hour left before Grandma's next dose was due at 11. Here we go then, cried George, jumping up from the table. A magic medicine it shall be. So give me a bug and a jumping flea, and give me 2 snails and lizards 3, and a slimy squiggler from the sea, and the poisonous sting of a bumblebee, and the juice from the fruit of the jujube tree, and the powdered bone of a wombat's knee, and 100 other things as well, each one with a rather nasty smell. I'll stir them up, I'll boil them long, a mixture tough, a mixture strong, then hi-ho and down it goes, and a nice big spoonful holds your nose. Just gulp it down and have no fear. How do you like it, Granny dear? Will she go pop? Will she explode? Will she go flying down the road? Will she go poof and up in a puff of smoke, start fizzing like a can of Coke? Who knows? Not I. Let's wait and see. I'm glad it's neither you or me. Oh, Grandma, if you only knew what I have got in store for you. Chapter 3. George begins to make the medicine. George took an enormous saucepan out of the cupboard and placed it in the kitchen table. George! Came the shrill voice from the next room. What are you doing? Nothing, Grandma, he called out. I needn't think I can't hear you just because you closed the door. You're rattling saucepans. I'm tidying the kitchen, Grandma. Then there was silence. George had absolutely no doubts whatsoever about how he was going to make his famous medicine. He wasn't going to fool about wondering whether to put a little bit of this in or a little bit of that. Quite simply, he was going to put everything he could find in. There would be no messing about, no hesitating, no wondering about whether this particular thing would knock the old girl sideways or not. The rule would be this: whatever he saw, if it was runny or powdery or gooey, in it went. Nobody had ever made a medicine like this before.
If it didn't actually cure Grandma, then it would anyway cause some exciting results. It would be worth watching. George decided to work his way around the various rooms one at a time and see what they had to offer. He would go first to the bathroom. There was always lots of funny things in a bathroom. So upstairs he went, carrying the enormous two-handled saucepan before him. In the bathroom he gazed longingly at the famous and dreaded medicine cupboard. But he didn't go near it. It was the only thing in the entire house he was forbidden to touch. He had made solemn promises to his parents about this, and he wasn't going to break them. There were things in there, they had told him, that could actually kill a person. And although he was out to give Grandma a pretty fearful, fiery mouthful, he didn't really want a dead body on his hands. George put the saucepan on the floor and went to work. Number 1 was a bottle of labelled Golden Gloss hair shampoo. He emptied it into the pan. "That ought to wash her tummy nice and clean," he said. He took a full tube of toothpaste and squeezed out the whole lot of it in one long worm. "Maybe that will brighten up those horrid brown teeth of hers," he said. There was an aerosol can of super foam shaving foam belonging to his father. George loved playing with aerosols. He pressed the button down and kept his finger on it until there was nothing left. A wonderful mountain of white foam built up in a giant saucepan. With his fingers he scooped out the contents of a jar of vitamin-enriched face cream. In went a bottle of scarlet nail varnish. "If the toothpaste doesn't clean her teeth," George said, "then this'll paint them as red as roses." He found another jar of creamy stuff labelled hair remover. "Smear it on your legs," it said, and allowed to remain for 5 minutes. George tipped it all in the saucepan. There was a bottle of yellow stuff inside. It called Dishworth's famous dandruff cure. In it went. There was something called Brilli-Dent for cleaning false teeth. It was a white powder. In that went too. He found another aerosol can. "Never more ponking deodorant spray. Guaranteed," it said, "to keep away unpleasant body smells for a whole day." "She could use plenty of that," George said, and he sprayed the entire canful into the saucepan. Liquid paraffin, the next thing was called. It was a big bottle. He hadn't the faintest idea what it did do, but he poured it in anyway. Then, he thought, looking around him, that was all for the bathroom. On his mother's dressing table in his bedroom, George found yet another aerosol can. It said, "Helga's hair set. Hold 12 inches away from the hair and spray lightly." He squirted the whole lot into the saucepan. He did enjoy squirting aerosols. There was a bottle of perfume called Flowers of Turnips. It smelled of old cheese. It went in. And into went a large round box of powder. It was called Pink Plaster. There was a powder puff on top, so he just threw that in as well for luck. He found a couple of lipsticks. He pulled the greasy red things out of their little cases and added them to the mixture. The bedroom had nothing more to offer, so George carried the enormous pan downstairs again and trotted into the laundry room where the shelves were full of all kinds of household items. The first one he took down was a large box of super white for automatic washing machines. "Dirt," it said, "will disappear like magic." George didn't know whether Grandma was automatic or not, but she was certainly a dirty old woman, so she'd better have it all, he said, tipping in the whole boxful. Then there was a big tin of Waxwell floor polish. "It removes filth and foul messes from your floor and leaves everything shining bright," it said. George scooped the orange-coloured waxy stuff out of the tin and plonked it in the pan. Then there was a round cardboard carton labelled "Flea powder for dogs. Keep well away from dog food," it said, "because this powder, if eaten, will make the dog explode." "Good," said George, pouring it all into the saucepan. He found a box of canary seeds on the shelf. "Perhaps this'll make the old bird sing," he said, and in it went. Next, George explored the box with shoe cleaning materials, brushes and tins and dusters. Well now, he thought, Grandma's medicine is brown, so my medicine must be brown, or she'll smell a rat. The way to colour it, he decided, would be with brown shoe polish. The large tin he chose was labelled dark tan. Splendid! He scooped it out with an old spoon and plopped it in the pan. He'd stir it up later. On his way back to the kitchen, George saw a bottle of gin standing on the sideboard.
Grandma was very fond of gin. She was allowed to have a small nip of it every evening. Now he would give her a treat. He would pour in the whole bottle. He did. Back in the kitchen, George put the huge saucepan on the table and went over to the cupboard that served as a larder. The shelves were bulging with bottles and jars of every sort. He chose the following and emptied them one by one into the saucepan. A tin of curry powder, a tin of mustard powder, a bottle of extra hot chili sauce, a tin of black peppercorns, and a bottle of horseradish sauce. "There," he said, "that should do."
"George!"
came the screechy voice from the next room.
"Who are you talking to in there? What are you up to?"
"Nothing, Grandma. Absolutely nothing," he said.
"Is it time for my medicine yet?"
"No, Grandma, not for about half an hour."
"Well, you see you don't forget."
"I won't," George answered. "I promise I won't." Animal pills. At this point, George suddenly had an extra good wheeze. Although the medicine cupboard in the house was forbidden, what about the medicines his father kept on the shelf in the shed next to the hen house? The animal medicines. What about those? Nobody ever told him he mustn't touch them. Let's face it, George said to himself. Hairspray and shaving cream and shoe polish are all very well, and they'll no doubt cause some splendid explosions inside the old lady. But what the magic mixture now needs is a touch of real stuff, real pills and real tonic, to give it a punch and muscle. George picked up the heavy 3/4 full saucepan and carried it out of the back door. He crossed the farmyard and headed straight for the shed alongside the hen house. He knew his father wouldn't be there. He was out haymaking on one of the meadows. George entered the dusty old shed and put the saucepan on the bench. Then he looked up at the medicine shelf. There were 5 big bottles there. 2 were full of pills, 2 were full of runny stuff, and 1 was full of powder. I'll use them all, George said. Grandma needs them. Boy, does she need them. The first bottle he took down contained an orange powder. The label said, "For chickens with foul pest, hen gripe, sore beak, gammy legs, cockroolitis, egg trouble, broodiness or loss of feathers, mix 1 spoonful only with each bucket of feed." "Oh," said George aloud to himself as he tipped the whole bottle full in. "The old bird won't be losing any feathers after she's had a dose of this." The next bottle he took down had about 500 gigantic purple pills in it. For horses with horse throat, it said. The horse-throated horse should suck 1 pill twice a day. Grandma may not have horse throat, George said, but she's certainly got a sharp tongue. Maybe that'll cure that instead. Into the saucepan went 500 gigantic purple pills. Then there was a bottle of thick, yellowish liquid for cows, bulls and bullocks. The label said, "Will cure cowpox, cow mange, crumpled horns, bad breath in bulls, earache, toothache, headache, hoofhache, tail-ache and sore udders." That grumpy old cow in the living room is every one of those rotten illnesses, George said. She'll need it all. And with a slop and a gurgle, the yellowish liquid splashed into its now nearly full saucepan. The next bottle contained a brilliant red liquid. Sheep dip, it said on the label, for sheep was sheep rot, and for getting rid of ticks and fleas. Mix 1 spoonful in with a gallon of water and slosh it over the sheep. Careful, do not make the mixture any stronger or the wool will fall out and the animal will be naked. "By gum," said George. "How I'd love to walk in and slosh that all over Grandma and watch the ticks and fleas go jumping off of her. But I can't. I mustn't. So she'll have to drink it instead," he said, and poured the bright red medicine into the saucepan. The last bottle on the shelf was full of pale green pills. "Pig pills," the label announced. "Pigs with pork prickles, tender trotters, bristle blight and swine sickness. Give 1 pill per day. In severe cases, 2 pills may be given, but more than that will make the pig rock and roll." "Just the stuff," George said. "For the miserable old pig back there in the house. She'll need a very big dose." He tipped all the green pills, hundreds and hundreds of them, in the saucepan. There was an old stick lying on the bench that had been used for stirring paint. George picked it up and stirred his marvellous concoction. The mixture was as thick as cream, and he stirred and stirred, and as he stirred, many wonderful colours rose up from the depths and blended together. Pinks, blues, greens, yellows and browns. George went on stirring until it was all well mixed. But even so, there were still hundreds and hundreds of pills lying at the bottom that hadn't melted. And there was still his mum's splendid powder puff floating on the surface. I'll have to boil it all up, George said. One good quick boil on the stove's all it needs. And with that, he staggered back towards the house with the enormous, heavy saucepan. On the way, he passed the garage, so he went in to see if he could find any other interesting things. He added the following: half a pint of engine oil to keep Grandma's engine running smoothly, some antifreeze to keep her radiator from freezing in the winter, and a handful of grease to grease her creaking joints. Then back to the kitchen. Oh dear, that Grandma's not a nice character, is she? But what's George doing? He's making his own medicine. Do you think that's a good idea? Oh, I don't think so. I think this might be a bit of a silly story. Let's remember what it said at the beginning. Do not try to make George's marvellous medicine yourself at home. It could be dangerous. But that's why a story's good, because it doesn't need to be true for us to read it. It's just a silly story, but we get to hear about some crazy things. So we'll read some more of George's marvellous medicine next time. See you soon.